Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from today? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now settle into a quiet place, breathe deep, and let the whispers of the Wild West carry you into tonight's tale. The Platte River churned fierce and cold, as if it meant to steal the soul straight from her chest. Grace sank beneath the surface, her soaked skirts wrapping around her legs like iron chains, darkness pressing in on her eyes. A sudden splash water breaking apart. Rough hands seized her shoulders, hauling her upward from the icy grip. She coughed hard upon the wet sand, the smell of mud and horsehide rising in the wind. Above her loomed the brim of a wide hat droplets, sliding down its edge into the blue eyes of a solitary cowboy. His voice rumbled low, raspy, yet steady, cutting through the roar of the river. Don't die. Live with me instead. And in that moment, between the cold shore and the warmth of his hand, the faint breath of hope stirred. Wyoming, May of 1875. Spring had not yet turned gentle, and the Platte raged wild. Snowmelt from the high mountains came crashing down, sharp and bitter as 1,000 blades against the skin. On the jagged banks, the wind carried the scent of wild grass and fresh mud, blending with the whisper of cottonwood leaves. Grace Wakefield stood there, her dress clinging heavy against trembling legs. At the corners of her eyes, tears mingled with the river's spray. Once she had been a young woman with simple dreams, a home, a love to hold on to. But lies and cruel hands had shattered it all. Now only one choice remained. Let the water take everything, even herself. She stepped in cold, slicing through to the heart. The river wrapped her tight, the arms of death pulling her into endless dark. And then at the edge of fading, she caught it, the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, followed by a sharp cry that tore through the water's roar. Stop a sudden force, ripped her upward, breaking the surface in a spray of foam. Strong arms fought the current, dragging her back toward life. Grace choked, gasping, her breath scattered in ragged bursts. When her eyes fluttered open, a figure came clear, a cowboy, his hat shadowing half his face, broad shoulders soaked through blue eyes burning bright in the sun. He laid her gently onto the wet grass, his hands still firm, making sure she was alive. His voice came again, hoarse, half anger and half mercy. You don't belong to death. Don't die. Live with me instead. It was madness to say such a thing. And yet there, on the riverbank, with her body shivering against the cold and his hands blazing warm, Grace could only stare in wonder. For in the cowboy's eyes, she saw no judgment, only the fragile glimmer of something else, a quiet invitation toward a different beginning. Part 1. The warning. The Platte River still raged on its foaming waves, white as teeth, eager to swallow any soul that dared fall into its heart. On the bank, the May wind lashed cold, heavy with dampness and the raw scent of fresh mud. Grace shivered. Her lips turned pale, each breath slicing her lungs like a blade. Clayton Reed knelt beside her, his large hand gripping her shoulder firmly, making sure she wouldn't throw herself back into the current. His breath came fast, carrying with it the scent of horse-soaked leather and the lingering smoke of a campfire clinging to his coat. In those deep blue eyes of his burned both anger and a quiet fear. Do you have any idea what you just tried to do? His voice was hoarse, rough as stone grinding on stone. Grace turned her face away, droplets sliding from her wet hair down her cheek. Her whisper broke weakly. I just wanted it to end. Clayton's grip tightened, forcing her to meet his gaze. End. By letting this river bury you like some nameless stone, you think your pain will vanish with the current? No. All it leaves is one more body for the crows to tear at and one more forgotten soul. His harsh words made Grace bite her lip. Her heart pounded, shaken by the raw truth and the eyes that gave her no room to hide. Amid the river's roar, his voice softened steady as wind flowing across the prairie. I don't know who you are or what's crushed you so badly you'd choose this. But when you gave yourself to this river, you handed the last of your hope over to the dark, and that is the most foolish thing I've ever seen. Grace trembled, not only from the cold. Shame welled up mixing with the sting of sorrow. She whispered, broken, you don't understand. You don't know anything about me. Clayton drew a long breath, his eyes catching the faint light of sunset. You're right. I don't. But I do know this: no one deserves to be carried off like that. No matter what you've lost or who's betrayed you, life is still here, and you have to hold on to it. At that moment, a lone wolf's cry echoed in the distance, pressing the emptiness of the western plains into her chest. Grace felt small, lost, yet under the cowboy's firm hand on her shoulder, a strange warmth held her back from slipping into the void. Clayton let out a weary sigh, then spoke again, his tone low and solemn like a vow. Listen to me. I won't let you die here. If your old life has ended, then let me show you how to begin again. He rose to his feet, extending a steady hand toward her, strong, unshaken, like a pillar, standing against the wilderness. Grace looked at that hand, her heart caught between two edges. On one side, the cold depths of the river. On the other, the unyielding blue eyes that refused to let her go. And then, trembling, her frozen fingers found their way into the cowboy's waiting palm. Part 2. The reason for the trial. Inside the small pine cabin, the fire snapped in the hearth, casting warm golden light across rough-hewn walls. The scent of burning resin mingled with the bitter aroma of coffee simmering in a black pot hung above the flames. Outside, the wind still howled through the mountain pass, but within the glow of fire and oil lamp carved out a fragile pocket of safety. Grace sat curled up, wrapped in the dry dress Clayton had given her fingers, clutching a steaming cup of tea until they flushed red. The rising steam blurred her tired eyes. It had been a long time since she'd felt safe enough just to breathe evenly. Clayton sat across from her, his broad frame quiet in the firelight. He pressed her with no questions, no urgency, only letting silence fill the room until she found her own words. Ranger the collie dog lay curled by the hearth, lifting his head now and then, as if listening too. You want to know why I chose the river? Grace's voice cracked rough and broken in the stillness. Clayton gave a slow nod. His eyes stayed on the flames, but his ears were open, a promise to hear her through. Grace gripped the cup tighter and let out a breath. His name was Edward Parker, a wealthy merchant's son from Denver. When he took notice of me, the whole town said I was fortunate, and I believed it. She paused, the heat rising not from the tea, but from searing memory. He was polite, attentive. I thought I had found a place to belong after my parents passed, after years of leaning on relatives. I trusted him. I agreed to be his bride. The firelight shimmered in her eyes like water glistening. Then I discovered he had a wife in St. Louis all along for 3 years. When I confronted him, he laughed in my face, said I was a fool to think he'd ever marry me, that I was nothing more than amusement. Her chest trembled, her breath catching. A hand drifted to her ribs, still aching faintly. When I threatened to tell the truth, he struck me. He swore if I ever spoke, he'd destroy what little name I had left with lies of his own. A tear fell into the cup. I went to my aunt, hoping she believed me. But she believed him. The whole town believed him. I became the liar in their eyes, the joke in their whispers. The cabin seemed to close in, filled only with the crackle of burning wood. Clayton lifted his gaze, his eyes' darkening jaw set so hard it turned pale. His voice rasped fierce. He isn't a man. He's a beast, dressed as one. Grace blinked, startled by the fury in a voice usually so steady. But then she realized the fire in his eyes wasn't scorn for her. It was anger burning for the man who had broken her. Clayton leaned back, his tone steadying firm as oak. Listen to me, Grace. Not a single wound he left is your fault. Not a single rumor he spreads defines who you are. What he destroyed was nothing but his own false honor, not yours. Grace lowered her head, tears spilling freely. For the first time in many months, she heard a voice without doubt, without judgment, only belief and sorrow for her. Ranger whined softly, answering her sobs. Clayton stretched his hand across the table. He didn't press, didn't demand. He simply placed that work-worn hand there, open and anchor waiting. Grace looked at it, the calloused fingers scarred from labor, the hand of a man who lived honestly. Slowly, timid as though frightened of herself, she laid her trembling hand into his. In the crackle of firelight, in the warmth of that cabin wrapped in the scent of burning wood and steeping tea, Grace felt something stir. For the first time, she wondered perhaps her life was not over after all. Perhaps in this harsh western land, kindness still had a place to shelter. Part 3. The Confirmation. Dawn crept gently over the Wyoming Valley, a faint rose light from the east, brushing away the last thin veil of mist across the grasslands. From the cabin door left, ajar Grace gazed out the sky, blooming orange sparrows darting from the cattle barn roof, and in the distance a herd of cattle slowly grazing on the spring green. Hoofbeats echoed steady in the yard, measured like the rhythm of a strong heart. Clayton had risen before first light. He stood beside the corral, a wooden bucket in hand, patting the neck of a chestnut horse. His figure, in the morning haze, tall, broad-shouldered breath, rising in the chill, held Grace still at the threshold, watching longer than she meant to. The night before, she had told almost the whole of her painful story, and he had sat through it silent, but present, his jaw tightening only when anger for her overcame him. No judgment, no prying curiosity. She had never known anyone quite like that. Grace pulled the cotton dress closer, the one Clayton had found in an old chest. It hung loose on her frame, but at least it was dry and clean. Her steps fell softly on the hard ground, mixing with the cool morning wind. Clayton lifted his head at the sound of the door closing behind her. His blue eyes shone calm, not surprised at all to see her step outside. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm, rough as wood rubbing wood. "Sleep well enough?" Grace nodded, lips trembling faintly. "Better than I thought. Thank you for everything." Clayton set the bucket down. brushing a strand of damp hair from his brow. "I thought a lot last night. You don't need to fear being a burden. Hear me, Grace." He stepped closer, the morning sun falling on his square-cut features. "You can stay here as long as you want. No one will force you to leave. I'll respect you." Simple words, yet in her heart, they rang like a church bell. She was used to suspicion, to cruel labels, to always having to prove her worth. But here, with a few words, a stranger gave her permission simply to exist. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, tears shining. She turned away quickly, but Clayton had seen. He said nothing, only stepped back, giving her space enough to breathe. That morning, Clayton led Grace around the ranch. Along the weathered fence, silvered by sun and wind, he explained his daily work, mending breaks, clearing pasture, checking the well. Grace listened, half curious, half shy. "Are there many horses here?" she asked, her eyes drifting toward the eastern stable. "5 or so. 3 for work, 1 for pulling the wagon, and a mare heavy with foal. By fall, I hope to see a colt running these fields." His voice softened, touched with pride. Grace caught the flicker of a smile on his face, and warmth rose in her chest. It had been so long since she'd heard someone speak of hope with eyes that bright. They stopped by the small garden behind the cabin. The soil lay rough and weedy, save for a few stray carrots and onions clinging to life. Grace knelt, pressing her palm to the morning damp earth, inhaling the rich scent. "If I had time, I could tend this again," she murmured. "My father taught me to plant vegetables when I was little." Clayton crossed his arms, watching her a moment before nodding. "If you wish. I believe a woman's hands can bring life even to the hardest ground." His words came lightly, yet within them was trust she had never once been given. Grace swallowed hard, her knees pressed to the earth as if some lost part of herself had just been returned. At midday, they ate on the porch. The breeze carried the fragrance of wild grass and pine, mixing with the steam of hot stew Clayton had simmered the night before. Grace handled her spoon awkwardly, stealing glances at him as he chewed a piece of dry bread, gaze wandering toward the mountains. "Have you lived alone long?" she ventured. Clayton set his spoon down, his eyes dimming. 2 years now, since my parents passed and my sister married off to Oregon. It's just me and Ranger." For a fleeting instant, Grace glimpsed loneliness etched deep at the corner of his eyes. It looked like the hollow within her own, a loss nothing could quite mend. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Clayton shook his head gently. "Don't be. Loss is part of life in the West. The only difference is, not everyone can bear it alone." The last words dropped onto the table like a small stone, yet they struck deep, tightening her chest. She realized he wasn't only speaking of himself, he was speaking of her too. By afternoon, Clayton led the horses to the creek. Grace followed her hand, brushing the neck of Daisy, the gentlest mare. She felt the warmth of its breath against her palm, and childhood memories came rushing fields with her father. The scent of cut grass, laughter unclouded, the stream glimmered under a vast blue sky. Clayton bent to scoop water, his voice carrying softly through the cool air. "You may not believe me yet, but remember what I said this morning. Stay as long as you like. Not because I need someone to cook or mend, but because I believe you deserve a place to stand." Grace froze her boots heavy with mud, her hand trembling over the water's surface. She dared not meet his eyes, afraid his gaze might break her heart wide open. Why she breathed, Clayton turned his face toward her, his blue eyes steady on her pale one. His reply was short, certain, because no one deserves to die alone by the river. At those words, Grace trembled. Tears rose again, but this time not only from sorrow. This time a fragile seed of faith had taken root. Night fell, and the cabin glowed once more with fire. Ranger curled in his corner, while Clayton spread a blanket near the hearth, leaving the bed for Grace. She sat still, listening to the wind through the cracks, her heartbeat easing after a long day. In her mind, his morning words echoed, "You can stay as long as you want." Just a single sentence, yet it lit a lamp in the dark room of her heart. For the first time since Denver, Grace did not feel adrift. She closed her eyes and whispered into the quiet maybe, "I'll try to begin again." And in the dim firelight, Clayton Reed lay still, eyes half closed, as if he too had heard her soft confession, as if silently confirming that from now on, neither of them would be entirely alone. Part 4. The Enemy Revealed. That night, when the fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, Grace tossed restlessly on the small bed in the cabin. Flickering shadows of the timber beams danced across the ceiling, but her eyes stayed wide open, her mind drifting back to where the pain had begun. Denver, just last winter, the city still alive with gaslight, the rumble of carriages on cobbled streets, the hurried clatter of boots through the snowy wind. Grace remembered clearly the night she first met Edward Parker at a merchant's ball. Edward had seemed the perfect gentleman, a velvet coat, a tender smile, brown eyes glinting with certainty. He invited her to dance beneath the golden chandeliers, his voice low and warm, pouring sweet promises into her ear. A young orphan girl living under a stern aunt stood no chance against such radiance. In those early months, Grace thought she had fallen into a dream. Edward strolled with her along the main street, bought her silk gloves and poetry books, spoke of a future together in St. Louis, of a house covered in roses. And then beneath a starless sky, he knelt and offered her a silver ring. Grace had said yes, her heart trusting completely. But happiness shattered as quickly as glass against stone. One afternoon, she went to Edward's office to speak of their wedding. The door was ajar, and what she saw froze her. On the desk lay an opened letter in a woman's hand. "Come home soon, Edward. The children miss their father." Her heart exploded. Trembling, she pieced it together. Edward had a legal wife in St. Louis, married 3 years with children. Every promise he'd made was a lie. When she confronted him, Edward did not deny it. Instead, he laughed. The sound cut her soul like a knife. "You're naive, Grace. Did you think a man like me would marry a penniless orphan? You were nothing but amusement while I stayed in Denver." Blood rushed hot to her face, yet her body shook helplessly. "You deceived me. You've ruined me." His smile vanished, replaced by a cold steel stare. He stepped close, his hand clamping her arm. "Listen carefully. If you breathe a word, I'll make you the laughingstock of this city. I'll tell them you gave yourself to me for rings and dresses. Who will they believe? An orphan girl or the son of a merchant?" The threat wasn't enough. Edward struck her the blow, burning her cheek. She fell hard, her head striking the corner of the desk. The taste of blood filled her mouth. "Keep silent, Grace," he hissed, "or you'll lose more than honor. You'll lose the only place you have in this world." She crawled up, tears mingling with blood, and saw the true face of the man she had once loved, a cruel deceiver. That memory stabbed her again in the quiet cabin. Her hand brushed the faint scar at her temple. That night in Denver, she had fled, carrying only her small savings and a shredded pride. Her aunt believed Edward's lies cast her out, called her a fraud. In the days after, whispers followed her through every street corner. She tried to steal another woman's husband. A shameless girl. Their scornful eyes trailed her every step. With nowhere left to stand, Grace left Denver carrying nothing but a battered trunk and a broken heart. And only days later, despair had driven her to the banks of the Platte River. In the cabin, Clayton stirred his steady breathing on the floor, pulling Grace back to the present. Tears soaked her pillow. The old fear clung to her still, as though Edward's claws stretched even to this distant land. She feared the lies might someday find her tearing apart the fragile peace Clayton had begun to give. Yet in her trembling, she remembered those blue eyes at midday, the gentle light when Clayton said, "You can stay here as long as you want. I'll respect you." Two forces pulled at her: the shadow from Denver and the light from this ranch. The next morning, as Clayton led the horses into the field, Grace followed, her face pale from a sleepless night. The sun painted the tall grasses gold dew, still clinging to the leaves. Clayton glanced back, reading the weariness on her face. Nightmares. Grace nodded, her eyes red. He laid a warm, steady hand on her shoulder, his voice soft as wind. "No one here has the right to hurt you, Grace. Do you hear me?" Her heart tightened. Such plain words, yet so solid, like a promise to stand between her and the ghosts of her past. And in that moment, for the first time, her hatred of Edward no longer strangled her. It turned instead into a flame, an urge that someday truth would rise. The dark memory closed like a door behind her, leaving both fury and a seed of strength. If Edward was proof of betrayal, then Clayton was proof that integrity still survived in this harsh western land. And Grace understood a new life could never begin while bowing forever to old fears. Part 5. The Promised Reward. Evening settled across the Wyoming prairie, the sun glowing red as fire as it sank behind the far-off ridges. The whole sky stretched wide like a great amber quilt orange, and gold melting into twilight blue, as if the land itself exhaled in slow relief. The cattle ambled toward the barn, the small bells at their necks chiming softly with the whisper of wind in the tall grass. Clayton rode ahead, his frame cast strong against the sunset. Grace followed on Daisy, the gentle mare he'd let her learn to ride. Her brown hair tumbled wild in the breeze, her cheeks touched pink, her eyes bright. For the first time in many months, she felt alive, breathing deeply, wholly. They stopped atop a grassy rise overlooking the valley. From here, the whole ranch spread out below the little pine cabin, with a thin column of smoke rising straight into the sky. The horse corral tucked behind. The green pastures shimmering, dotted with cattle grazing their last before nightfall. Clayton turned, gesturing toward it all. His voice rolled slow, steady as hoofbeats. "That is home." Grace lifted her gaze, a strange swell rising in her chest. For her home had long been only a memory, the house where her parents once lived, lost to sickness. Then her aunt's porch, steeped in scorn. She had never dared believe she might have a home again. "Your home," she whispered, her voice unsteady. Clayton's lips curved faintly, his blue eyes catching the last light. Our home if you choose it. Not grand, not rich. But here there is peace. Here no one can judge you or harm you again. The words swept over her like wind across open fields, reaching the deepest places of her heart. Tears welled, not of shame, but of hope. Tears born of a safety she had thought gone forever. They sat together on the rise, the sunset spilling honey-colored light. Ranger bounded in circles, then settled at Clayton's boots. The scene was so simple, so whole, that Grace felt her heart crack open, letting new light in. "Don't you fear loneliness?" she asked, her voice soft as breeze. Clayton thought a long while. "I do. Many nights, hearing the wind howl through the roof, I felt like a shadow. But each morning when the sun rose behind the hills, I told myself, being alive means another chance. And now, I'm no longer alone." Grace lowered her eyes, fingers brushing a blade of grass. Her heart hammered. She knew he meant her, though he didn't look straight at her. Every word of his rang with plain, unhidden truth. As darkness deepened, stars kindled overhead. Clayton built a small fire outside the cabin. They sat side by side, firelight flickering on his scarred hands, on the fine lines of worry around her eyes. "Grace," he said softly, voice deep as an undertow, "I cannot erase your past, but I can promise this from now on here, you'll have a place. No one will take that from you." She turned her eyes glistening. "Do you truly believe I deserve that?" Clayton nodded firmly. "Every soul deserves a home, a place called safe. You most of all, after all you've endured." The wind rose, fanning the flames higher, as though sealing his vow. Grace's chest eased the tightness, giving way for the first time. The next morning, sunlight poured through the cabin window. Grace woke to familiar sounds, the rooster's crow, the horse's calls, Clayton's footsteps on the porch. She dressed simply and stepped into the yard. Clayton was fastening a fence rail tall and steady under the golden light. When he saw her, he smiled, rare, but bright enough to lift the air around them. "Sleep well?" he asked. Grace nodded, her heart stirring. Peacefully, for the first time in months. He gestured toward the patch of earth she had noticed before. "If you'd like, we'll start with the garden. A house only truly lives when hands tend its soil." Grace gazed at the dry ground, but this time she saw not barrenness, but an invitation, a chance to plant seeds in the earth and in her own life. By afternoon, they worked side by side pulling weeds. Soil clung to her hands, its scent rising fresh and strong. Clayton handed her a hoe, his calloused fingers brushing hers warm steady. Such a simple touch, yet it told her plainly she was no longer alone. When the sun sank low, they rested on the cabin steps. Wildflowers scented the breeze. Clayton offered her a cup of water, his voice low. "Home is not only shelter, it's where a heart finds peace. I hope you find that here." Grace held the cup, smiling softly in the amber glow. "I already have." In that moment, under a sky alive with stars and the hum of crickets, Grace knew the truest reward, after all her loss, was not wealth or comfort, but the chance to begin again in a home she had never dared dream of. And for the first time, a single word rang clear within her heart safe. Part 6. A Clear Sign. On the 4th of July that year, the town of Pine Creek pulsed with life so different from its usual quiet. The main street was dressed in red, white, and blue flags fluttering in the summer breeze. From the wooden houses came the scent of fresh pies and smoked meat blending with the lively notes of a banjo. Grace stood beside Clayton, her heart caught between excitement and unease. It was the first time she had stepped into a crowd after so many hidden months. She wore a blue calico dress she had stitched herself by lamplight, trimmed with plain white lace. It had taken her many nights to believe she was worthy of wearing it beneath the gaze of others. Clayton tied his horse near the livery, his tall frame standing out among the gathering. A man used to solitude, he now wore a clean white shirt, a dark vest, his hair combed neatly. Grace noticed a few curious glances from townsfolk, but at once, Martha Wilson, the livery owner's wife, came forward with a gentle smile. "Clayton." "And this must be Miss Grace?" she asked kindly. Grace nodded, her voice soft. "Yes, ma'am. It's an honor." Martha clasped her hand, squeezing lightly. "We're glad he's found company. Clayton's been alone far too long." Simple words, yet they stung Grace's eyes with tears. This community did not turn her away, did not look at her with the scorn she had known in Denver. Here they saw only a woman standing beside a man worthy of respect. Music swelled from a small stage near the church. Children ran with flags tracing circles in the dusty ground. Families laid out food on long wooden tables, apple pies, smoked ham, pickled vegetables. The air was filled with laughter, warmth, and the comfort of belonging. Clayton and Grace sat at a table with the Wilsons and Johnsons. Emma Johnson, younger than Martha, leaned closer and whispered, "The whole town's watching. But don't worry. Here kindness counts for more than rumor." Grace's hesitant smile grew steadier. For months, she had lived fearing her past would catch her. But in Pine Creek, she felt a door cracking open to something new. As the sun sank, Mayor Peterson's voice rang deep and sure. He spoke of freedom of settlers carving life from new land, of unity on a harsh frontier. The crowd erupted in applause, flags waving bright. At the table, Clayton's hand rested near hers. His calloused fingers lay only an inch away. Grace's heart pounded. Since the riverbank, he had reached for her many times, but never once had she dared reach back. The first fireworks cracked overhead, bursting red against the night. Grace drew a deep breath. Then, almost without thinking, she slipped her hand into his. Clayton stilled his blue eyes, turning toward her. He spoke no word, only tightened his grip. His hand was warm, steady, wrapping around her trembling one. Above them, fireworks blossomed into radiant light, revealing a shy, unguarded smile on Grace's face. From a short distance, Martha Wilson watched her lips curving in quiet joy. Emma touched her arm, whispering, "Do you see it?" For the first time in years, there's something new in Clayton's eyes, like he's found what was missing. Martha nodded, her gaze tender. "I just pray the girl has the courage to stay and enough faith to begin again." When the fireworks ended, music shifted into dance. Couples joined hands, circling in the square. Clayton glanced at Grace, a question in his eyes. "It's been so long since I've danced," she murmured. "Your feet will remember," he replied with a faint smile. Rising, he offered his hand. Grace hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. They joined the circle, their first steps awkward, then quickly finding rhythm. Boots scuffed, dust skirts spun, laughter rippled under the night sky. Each time Grace faltered, Clayton's hand steadied her, his eyes calm, reassuring. She looked up into that weathered face, and without warning, A laugh slipped from her lips, the first true laugh in many months. When the music faded, they stepped away, returning to their table beneath the great oak. The night breeze cooled her cheeks, carrying the faint tang of powder from the fireworks. Grace leaned back against the bench, her heart still racing. "Do you come to festivals often?" she asked. "No." Clayton sipped his lemonade, his voice low. "For years I kept away from crowds, but tonight, I'm glad I came." Her eyes met his, her cheeks warm. "So am I." And in that quiet exchange, no further words were needed. Among the noise of celebration, the sparks of something unspoken bound their two once lonely hearts. Later, under a silver moon, they rode from Pine Creek along the dirt road home. Crickets sang. The air smelled of dry grass and dust. Grace clung gently to Clayton's waist, her hand steady against his side, feeling the strength of him. In the hush of the ride, his voice reached her soft but clear. "Today you smiled. I want to see that smile again." Grace pressed her cheek against his warm back, whispering like a vow, "With you, maybe I can." And as the horses carried them into the night, the sky still held the fading glow of fireworks. But within Grace's heart, a new flame had been lit, one no darkness could ever put out. Part 7. Sacred Protection. On that summer afternoon in Wyoming, the sky darkened without warning. Clouds pressed in heavy from the mountains as if a great gray blanket were being drawn across the land. Clayton and Grace were driving the cattle near the creek when the wind shifted cold and sharp. "A storm's coming," Clayton said quickly, lifting his eyes. "We need shelter now." Thunder boomed, rolling like distant cannons. Within minutes, rain fell hard, each drop as heavy as corn kernels stinging against the skin. Daisy whinnied. Grace tugged at the reins, her heart pounding. Clayton urged his horse forward, shouting over the roar. "There's a line shack half a mile ahead. Follow me." They galloped through sheets of rain mud flying high, soaking their clothes. At last, a small wooden shack loomed through the downpour. Clayton swung down, guided Grace inside, then quickly tied the horses under a lean-to. The shack was dark bare, save for a rough table, 2 worn chairs, and a narrow bed layered with dust. Rain hammered the tin roof, lightning flashing across Grace's pale face, her dress clinging, her body trembling. Clayton rummaged through an old chest, pulling out 2 weathered shirts. Turning his back, his voice rasped low, "Change before you freeze." "I'll keep my eyes away." Grace nodded, hands shaking. She slipped into the oversized shirt, rough but dry its warmth, easing her chills. When she turned back, Clayton had changed as well, his damp hair falling across his brow, his broad shoulders outlined in the soft glow of an oil lamp he had lit. The small space made every breath feel close. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the fabric tight. Outside, thunder cracked, rain drummed like 1,000 hammers. Clayton settled at the table, his voice careful. "Are you cold?" Grace gave a faint nod. He hesitated, then moved closer, sitting a short distance from her on the bed. "Closer. It'll be warmer." She wavered, then shifted. Their shoulders brushed a warmth passing between them, stronger than the fire they lacked. Grace closed her eyes. The storm still raged, but with him near it felt as though a wall stood between her and the fury outside. Time slowed, carried only by rain and the beat of her heart. At last, Clayton spoke, his voice, low, but steady. "Grace, there's something I've needed to say." She turned, eyes wide, breath caught. "The day I pulled you from the river, I thought I was saving a life. But these months since, I know now. It was you who saved me. Before you, I was only existing work, sleep, repeat. You brought laughter, breath, life itself. You made me live again. Grace sat, frozen tears rising, blurring the lamplight. Clayton drew a breath, his voice trembling, yet sure. I love you, Grace Wakefield. I love you wholly without condition. I ask nothing but to stand by you to protect you. If you're not ready, I'll wait. But I needed you to know. The shack held its breath, save the pounding storm. Grace lifted her hand, touching his lips gently. Clayton, do you know, that day at the river, I thought I had nothing left to live for. But with each day here, you've shown me there is still kindness, still good in the world. You didn't just save my life. You gave me faith again. Her voice shook, but her eyes burned bright. And I love you too. Clayton searched her gaze, afraid it might be only a dream. But the truth shone there, steady as dawn. He lowered his lips to hers. The kiss began fragile, uncertain, then grew flaring like fire in the storm. Grace wrapped her arms around his neck, drawing him close. Outside, the tempest roared, but within the shack, there was only the thrum of two hearts joined. When they parted, Clayton rested his forehead to hers, whispering, "No one will ever hurt you again. You'll never face another storm alone. I'm here, always here." Grace wept, but with tears of release. In his arms, she felt a sacred protection, a shield that would not break. Beyond the walls, the thunder faded, the rain softened to a quiet patter. Inside, the oil lamp cast its warm glow, revealing two souls resting against one another at peace after the storm. That night, they did not sleep. They sat close, sharing dreams, once too fragile to speak aloud, a garden reborn, a winter with fire shared, a home no longer empty. And when dawn slipped pale light through the small window, Clayton tightened his hand around hers, as if to say the storm in her life had truly passed. Part 8. Your Mission. Summer in Wyoming came as swiftly as hoofbeats racing across the prairie. After that great storm, the sky seemed clearer. The grass grew greener. Sunshine spilled gold over the fields, sharpening every rugged line of life on the ranch. Each morning, Grace woke to the sound of roosters, crowing cattle lowing in the far pastures, and the steady rhythm of Clayton's hammer as he mended fences. Once a woman who had nearly given herself to the river, she now rose early, tied on an apron, lit the stove, and set breakfast with steady hands. The first day, Clayton gave her an official task. He pressed a worn pair of leather gloves into her hands. "Put these on," he said, his eyes bright, his voice firm. "Today you and I are going to the garden. If you want to live here, the land needs to know your name." Grace smiled faintly, sliding her hands into the oversized gloves. Together, they pulled weeds, turned soil, pressed seeds into rows. The rough earth cut at her nails, but the mingled scent of dirt and sweat carried with it a simple joy. "Do you think this ground can come back to life?" she asked, wiping her brow. Clayton leaned on his hoe, studying the patch. His answer came certain. "With you here, I do." Her cheeks flushed, but in her heart, confidence stirred. Day by day, Grace grew into ranch life. Mornings, she fed chickens, milked cows, churned butter. By noon, she was in the fields, with Clayton laying hay to dry, breathing in the sweet scent of fresh-cut grass. Afternoons, she stitched torn shirts and mended horse tack. At first, her soft hands blistered and cracked, but instead of surrendering, she pressed on. Clayton guided patiently, never mocking her mistakes. He only said, "Every scar on your hands proves you're growing stronger." One evening, he led her to the horse barn, resting his palm on the neck of a mare heavy with foal. "She's close to birthing. Do you have the courage to stay with me?" Grace swallowed hard, then nodded. That night, under the glow of a single lamp, they waited. The mare strained her cry sharp in the dark. Grace clung to Clayton's hand until at last the thin whimper of a newborn colt broke the silence. Wobbling on unsteady legs, it stood. Grace burst into tears covering her face. Clayton drew her close, his voice low and steady. "That's life, Grace, and you were part of it." In that moment, she knew she belonged. Days passed and she rode alongside him on the open range. At first, she wobbled in the saddle, but Clayton kept close, ready to steady the reins. Within weeks, she was riding strong, her hair flying free, laughter breaking from her lips. Once, while driving cattle, a calf bolted. Grace urged Daisy forward, cutting a clean arc to block its path. Clayton whistled, a rare smile spreading. "Well done. You just did a rancher's work." Grace sat high in the saddle, heart, racing eyes alight. The word rancher echoed in her ears as though it had always been a piece of her destiny. Evenings found them on the porch, Grace stitching a tear in Clayton's shirt, while sunset burnished his face to bronze. Ranger dozed at their feet. "Do you ever regret?" she asked softly, "bringing me back that day?" Clayton shook his head, his eyes unwavering. "Never. Each day proves I was right. You've brought life into this place." Grace stilled her needle, gazing at him long and deep. Her heart whispered, "This is my mission, not just to survive, but to build, to bring life again." As summer's heat grew fierce, the ranch grew busier. Grace was no longer a guest. She carried hay bales, cleared troughs, worked side by side with Clayton. When townsfolk from Pine Creek stopped by, their eyes held no curiosity now but respect. One afternoon, Emma Johnson arrived with a basket of apples. "Everyone's seen how hard you work, Grace. You're not just visiting, you're part of this place." Grace took the basket, her throat tight. She thought of the river of the day she had nearly let go. If not for Clayton's hand that reached for her, would she ever have lived to hear these words? That summer night, the moon poured silver over the land. Grace stood on the porch, breathing in the warm scent of hay and soil. Clayton joined her, two wooden cups in hand. "For you," he said, offering fresh milk. Grace took it, smiling. They stood together beneath the stars, quiet in their wonder. And within her, a voice rose clear. "This is my mission, not to end in despair, but to live fully here beside this man." Ranger barked softly. Clayton turned, his blue eyes glimmering in moonlight. "You know, Grace, you're not just a guest anymore. You've become a ranch wife in every sense. I'm proud of you." Her lips trembled, tears spilling tears, not of sorrow, but of new strength. She knew at last her life's purpose was no longer to bear the weight of old wounds. Her mission was to nurture, to build, to breathe love back into this home. She was no victim now. She was the heart of the ranch. Part 9. The Second Confirmation. That evening, the sunset was more beautiful than any before. The sun sank behind distant hills, leaving the sky awash in a sea of gold and amber tinged with violet. The world seemed to pause, holding only the faint hum of crickets and the lowing of cattle drifting home. On the porch of the wooden cabin, Grace sat at a small table, her hands busy stitching Clayton's shirt. The needle slipped in and out, catching the last light on its silver thread. From inside, the scent of cornbread filled the air, mingling with the warmth of pine. Clayton stepped out his boots, dusty from a long day's work. He stopped at the threshold, taking in the sight the woman he had once pulled from a river, now seated in quiet peace, as if she had always belonged here. He moved closer, setting a wooden cup of fresh milk before her. "Drink this, ease your hands." Grace looked up, her brown eyes glinting with sunset's glow. She smiled softly, lifted the cup to her lips. "Thank you." In that moment, Clayton's heart struck hard. For weeks, he had carried words unspoken, fearful they might overwhelm her, fearful her past still held her back. But tonight, with the light burnishing her hair to gold, he knew the time had come. He sat across from her, then without pause, rose again. Stepping closer, he dropped to one knee before her. "Clayton," Grace whispered, cloth still in her hand. He lifted his face, his blue eyes gathering the whole twilight sky. His voice came deep measured, each word etched into the quiet. "Grace Wakefield, the day I pulled you from the river, I never knew I was placing my life into your hands. You've turned this lonely place into a home. You've given me reason to laugh, to hope, to believe tomorrow is worth living." Grace's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling fast, choking back words. Clayton reached, taking her hand, the same hand that once trembled, now worn with honest work, but to him more beautiful than any jewel. "Grace, will you be my wife? Not to tend the house, not to ease the chores, but because I need you. Your heart, your strength, even your scars. I want to shoulder them with you. I want to build a future together." The sunset blazed as though the heavens themselves blessed it. Grace's tears fell hot upon his hand. She nodded, her voice breaking like a whisper of wind. "Yes, Clayton, I will." At once he rose, pulling her into his arms. He lifted her high, spinning her on the porch, laughter breaking loose, rare and free. Ranger barked, circling them in joy. Grace pressed her face to his shoulder, sobs mingling with laughter. In his arms, every shadow, every fear melted away. Later, seated on the porch steps, their hands still entwined, the sky stretched wide and star-filled above them. The night breeze carried the scent of hay and warm cornbread. "Are you sure?" Grace whispered, still afraid it was too much to believe. Clayton turned his eyes steady. "I've never been more sure of anything. You are what I was missing, Grace. And I want the world to know you as my wife." She leaned her head against his shoulder, smiling through tears. "Then from now on, I'll never be lost again. I'll call this place home, and you my husband." They sat long beneath the heavens, each star a blessing cast over them. Their love was no longer only the salvation of a river's edge, it was a vow of a lifetime. And in a land where people lost more often than they gained, Grace and Clayton had found something rare, a love strong enough to turn sorrow into joy, the wild frontier into a safe home. Part 10. The Final Promise. October came, and Pine Creek dressed itself in autumn's golden robe. Maples along the road blazed with color, their leaves swirling in the wind, carpeting the steps of wooden homes. The air turned crisp, carrying the smoke of hearth fires from every chimney. That morning, the church bell rang, not urgent, but solemn and clear. Folks from Pine Creek gathered carrying pies, wildflowers, and smiles of blessing. They knew this was the day Clayton Reed, the quiet cowboy, would wed the woman he had once pulled from the river's grasp. In a small room behind the church, Grace sat before a wooden mirror. Her dress was no fine silk, but a gown of ivory cotton she had sewn herself, trimmed with lace carefully added by Martha and Emma. Her hair was swept up, adorned with white daisies gathered from the ranch meadow. Her hand brushed the mirror's surface, eyes glistening. A year ago, she had been a woman adrift, ready to surrender her life to the Platte. Today, she was a bride, her heart racing not with fear, but with joy. Martha entered, smiling softly. "You're beautiful, Grace, and you deserve this." Grace gripped her hand, whispering, "I never thought I'd see this day." Martha squeezed back. "God has his ways. What matters is you held on to the hand that saved you." In the main hall, Clayton waited. He wore his father's old vest, pressed neat, his face simple, yet shining brighter than ever. Ranger sat loyally outside the doors, as if keeping watch. When the organ began, all eyes turned. Grace appeared, walking slowly, steadily. Light through the stained glass fell across her face, her eyes no longer shadowed by fear, but radiant with trust. Clayton swallowed hard, his heart thundering. All sound faded, leaving only the sound of her footsteps coming closer. Reverend Peterson's voice rose warm and sure. "We are gathered to witness a sacred covenant, not just a marriage, but a promise between two souls who found each other in life's desert." Clayton took Grace's hand, roughened fingers curling around hers. His voice shook, but held firm. "Grace, I vow to guard you from every storm, to mend fences, plant seeds, and never again let you face the dark alone. The day you stepped into my life, I found home. Today, I promise to keep that home forever." Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her smile glowed. She answered, her voice trembling yet strong. "Clayton, you pulled me from the river's cold. You didn't just save my life. You gave me courage, faith, and a place to belong. I vow to be your shelter, to share your joys and your burdens. From this day until my last, my heart is yours." The Reverend smiled, raising his hand. "Before God and this community, I pronounce you husband and wife. Clayton, you may kiss your bride." He kissed her, then not in haste, but with eternal certainty. Applause thundered as their lips met, sealing away all past sorrow. The wedding supper was simple cornbread roast cider. Children laughed and ran. Neighbors cheered, each blessing the couple, as though their happiness belonged to all of Pine Creek. Emma whispered to Grace, "You've found not just a husband, but a family here." Grace squeezed her hand through tears. Yes, she had been accepted. That evening, as friends drifted home, Clayton and Grace returned to the ranch. The last golden light spilled across the fields, the cattle settled, and Ranger bounded with joy. Clayton lifted Grace in his arms, carrying her over the cabin's threshold. "Welcome home, my wife," he whispered. Her eyes glowed as she clung to him. "I've been home ever since you said, 'Live with me instead of dying.'" They laughed through tears, sealing it with another gentle kiss. That night, the harvest moon rose over the prairie. In their small room, the lamp cast a warm glow upon two faces side by side. No river, no shadows of the past, only two souls joined by a sacred promise. Grace knew she had found all she once thought lost a home, a husband, and a love stronger than the harshest western winter. The following May spring returned to Wyoming. A creek wound through the greening pasture, its waters clear as glass bordered by wildflowers of every color. Grace sat on a flat stone, brown hair, loose in the breeze, her hands resting on her rounded belly. She carried within her a new life, the fruit of love and renewal. Clayton came behind her, his strong arms encircling her shoulders. His warmth covered her as he asked gently, "Are you tired?" She shook her head, smiling. "No, just remembering. Here a year ago my life ended and began again." He held her closer, his chin brushing her hair. "I think often, what if I hadn't passed that river that day?" She turned, laying her hand on his cheek. "Don't. Think instead that God placed you there. I don't want to imagine it any other way." Her brown eyes shone with faith, his blue eyes with gratitude. Spring wind carried the scent of flowers. Clayton sat beside her, drawing her against his chest, his heartbeat steady like a drum. "Do you remember?" He whispered the first words I said when I pulled you out. Grace laughed softly. "Don't die. Live with me instead." They let the words linger. Once they had been a lifeline. Now they were truth. A life shared, a family growing. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. He kissed her brow, voice firm. "If there's one thing I'm certain of, it's this: saving you was the best choice I ever made." Tears glistened, but they were tears of joy. She rested on his shoulder hand, laced with his, a fullness wrapping her whole being. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. Ranger barked, bounding through the meadow. Above them, the sky stretched vast and blue clouds, drifting lazy as witnesses to their love. Clayton leaned close, murmuring, "When our child grows, I'll tell them how their mother once wanted to give up, but chose life again, and that she became the heart of this ranch." Grace laughed through tears, pressing her hand to her belly. "I only hope the baby inherits your blue eyes and your kind heart." He kissed her hair, voice sure they'll have it all: the eyes of their mother, her courage, and the love we've built together. As the sun lowered, gilding the creek with firelight, Grace whispered, "Sometimes from the edge of despair, the brightest chapter begins." Clayton nodded his hand, holding hers tight. And sometimes one outstretched hand is enough to change destiny. They sat together, listening to the water, watching the prairie bathe in gold. Time seemed to pause, leaving only gratitude, fullness, and peace. A year ago, the river had marked an ending. Now the creek bore witness to a beginning. Grace was no longer a broken woman. She was a wife, a mother, and at last herself. Clayton was no longer a lonely cowboy. He had found a home and a family. And both knew storms would come again. But with each other, nothing could ever sweep them away. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment with your city and rate it from 0 to 10. Don't forget to subscribe for more healing tales of the Wild West.